She sat there with a straight back and folded hands, the perfect portrait of a wife who had learned to be silent. 6 years of being ignored had taught her one lethal lesson: even her death wouldn't be important enough to interrupt his phone call. So, she didn't say a word. She simply let the darkness take her, sliding silently toward the floor. By the time Lorenzo finally looked up, the dinner was over. And so was she. The silence where her soft breathing usually was finally cut through the air, sharper than any business negotiation. Lorenzo turned, and for the first time in 6 years, he truly saw her, not as the background noise of his life, but as a body slumped against the velvet chair. One hand was still pressed to her chest, her lips tinged with a faint, terrifying purple. He called her name, his voice rising from a distracted murmur to an urgent, ragged shout, but there was no response. The Iron Boss, a man who had survived assassinations and negotiated million-dollar betrayals without flinching, felt genuine fear settle in his bones as he realized the space she always filled was now terrifyingly empty. The room exploded into a chaotic blur of motion. Senior advisors stood so quickly their chairs scraped like gunfire against the hardwood floor. His mother, Sophia, was the only one who didn't panic. She moved with the stillness of a woman who had survived decades in this world by noticing what others dismissed. Her eyes snapped from the purple-black stain on the white linen napkin to her other son, whose face had drained of all color. Sophia didn't scream. She took command with a voice that landed like a gavel, ordering the doors locked and a private doctor summoned immediately. "Get her on the floor," Sophia commanded, her eyes burning into Lorenzo. "Keep her conscious." Lorenzo lifted her, and the breath caught in his throat. She was lighter than he remembered, fragile and breakable in his arms. He realized with a jolt of shame that he had forgotten what it felt like to actually hold his wife. He lowered her to the cold floor, pressing 2 shaking fingers to her wrist, searching for a pulse that was faint and irregular. He had learned to stabilize wounds in the Marines, but as he stared at her unfocused eyes, he realized he had no idea how to fix the damage he had caused by simply never looking at her. Through the metallic burn and the agonizing stutter of her heart, she felt his arms around her. She heard him saying her name, not the distracted version used to ask for a schedule update, but a voice that was urgent and afraid. And beneath the terror that her children might grow up without a mother, she felt a shameful, sickening relief. She finally mattered. Even if mattering meant dying, she was no longer invisible. Welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe. The private dining room at the Meridian Steakhouse was a masterclass in luxury and coldness, featuring mahogany tables and crystal stemware that caught the amber glow of the chandelier. At the center sat Lorenzo, the boss everyone called untouchable, dressed in a sharp black suit with his phone out, scrolling through spreadsheets while carrying on a conversation. It was a scene that had repeated itself for years. He had even answered emails during their daughter's last parent-teacher conference. To his right was his younger brother, sweating despite the air conditioning, and at the end sat the matriarch, Sophia, watching everything with the stillness of a woman who survived by noticing what others dismissed. On the left side of the table sat Elena, dressed in an expensive cream silk gown that had been purchased by Lorenzo's assistant, not him. Her hands were folded perfectly in her lap, her posture the very portrait of compliance. For 6 years, she had been the family's shock absorber, softening the edges of the traditional matriarch's criticisms and translating Lorenzo's cold pragmatism into warmth for their triplet. She held the space that no one remembered to thank her for, becoming so good at managing the household and raising the children mostly alone that everyone had simply stopped noticing she was doing it. This was the geometry of a family dinner that looked perfect from the outside, but was fracturing from within. Elena was background noise, competent, useful, essential, and yet completely unseen. She was good at reading rooms because she had to be, and tonight, the room was screaming at her. She noticed the accountant sitting 2 seats down, glancing nervously at Lorenzo's brother as if waiting for a disaster to strike. She recognized the rhythm of guilt. It was the same way her 4-year-old son drummed his fingers when he had broken something and was waiting to see if anyone noticed. When the sommelier arrived with the wine Lorenzo had ordered without looking up, Elena's pulse quickened. The apology for the delay was too smooth, too rehearsed. As the expensive Bordeaux was poured into the glasses she had picked out herself years ago, she realized the man who controlled shipping routes and business empires was too distracted to see the trap being laid on his own table. He spoke fluently in the language of logistics and numbers, a language he never taught her because he believed she didn't understand the business. But Elena understood desperation, and she understood that the 18 inches of silence between them was about to become a canyon they might never cross. Elena watched the way the wine settled. The viscosity was off, just slightly. Under the overhead lights, she saw it, a faint, sickly green shimmer beneath the deep red. It was a warning meant for the man who hadn't looked at her in 3,000 days, but as he reached for the glass while still debating container manifests, she realized the truth. She had spent 6 years being invisible, a ghost in a designer dress. If she spoke now, he would call her paranoid. If she did nothing, he would die. But as she looked at his face, still illuminated by the blue light of his phone, a third option took root, not to save the king, but to finally let the ghost disappear. The atmosphere in the private suite was suffocating, thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the sharp tang of chilled iron. Lorenzo remained buried in his device, a man who believed his power made him untouchable, unaware that the very air around him had begun to sour. But Elena felt it. She had spent 6 years perfecting the art of observation from the sidelines, learning to read the subtle shifts in a room that her husband had long ago deemed beneath his notice. To Lorenzo, the staff were merely tools and his family members were pillars of his legacy, but to Elena, they were human beings with tells. Tonight, every tell was screaming. She watched the sommelier's hands as he presented the bottle. His movements were too precise, his bow a fraction of a second too deep, like an actor terrified of missing a cue. His voice held a practiced smoothness that lacked the genuine arrogance of a man who worked at a Michelin star establishment. It was the sound of someone who had rehearsed a lie until it felt like a script. Lorenzo didn't even look up as his glass was filled, continuing to argue about shipping manifests and customs clearance. He was so occupied with the logistics of his empire that he failed to notice the man serving him was trembling. Elena's gaze shifted to Lorenzo's brother, Marco, sitting across from them. He was sweating despite the room being kept at a perfect, frigid temperature. His fingers drummed against the white linen cloth, once, twice, 3 times, before stopping abruptly. It was a rhythm Elena knew by heart. It was the same restless beat their 4-year-old son produced when he was hiding a broken toy, waiting for the inevitable moment of discovery. It was the rhythm of a man who had already committed a sin and was now just waiting for the world to catch fire. Every sense she possessed was on high alert, a survival instinct honed by years of being the family's silent shock absorber. She looked at the wine again as the overhead chandelier's amber glow hit the crystal. The deep red of the Bordeaux was marred by a faint, oily shimmer that didn't belong. It settled into the glass with a heavy, sluggish viscosity, far too thick for a vintage of that caliber. Underneath the rich crimson, a ghostly green light flickered, a chemical warning that the wine was no longer life, but a death sentence. Lorenzo reached for the stem of the glass, his thumb still hovering over a spreadsheet, his mind miles away in a boardroom in Singapore. He saw numbers, routes, and profit margins. He didn't see the poison. He didn't see his brother's knuckles turning white or the sommelier's retreating back. He was the iron boss, the man who controlled everything, yet in this moment, he was the most vulnerable person in the room because he had forgotten that the people he ignored were the ones who could destroy him. Elena watched his fingers close around the crystal, the 18 inches between them feeling like a vast, unbridgeable canyon. She realized then that her invisibility, the very thing that had slowly erased her over the last 6 years, was the only reason she was the only one in the room who knew he was about to die. Lorenzo's hand closed around the stem of the glass, his eyes still fixed on the blue light of his phone as he debated container manifests and customs clearance. He was a man who spoke the language of logistics fluently, but he had never bothered to teach it to Elena because he believed she couldn't understand the business. In that moment, she realized she had exactly 3 seconds before the liquid touched his lips. 3 seconds to decide if she would remain the invisible guardian of his empire or if she would finally let the silence take them both. Her mind calculated the options with a cold, desperate clarity. Option 1 was to speak. She could reach out, grab his arm, and warn him that the wine shimmered with a sickly green light that Bordeaux shouldn't possess. But she knew how that would end. He would look at her with that familiar, distracted irritation and dismiss her as paranoid or hysterical. He would tell her that she didn't understand how these dinners worked, and if she were wrong, she would be humiliated for causing a scene over nothing. Option 2 was to say nothing. She could sit with her back straight and her hands folded, a portrait of compliance, and watch him drink. She could watch the man who had ignored her for 6 years finally stop breathing. She would become the widow everyone pitied but no one actually saw, raising their triplet alone in a mansion that had always felt more like a tomb than a home. For a heartbeat, the thought of his death felt like the only way she could ever truly be free of the 18 inches of ice that separated them. But then there was the third option, the one that made no logical sense but felt like an inevitability. She looked at the glass and then at the man who treated her like background noise, and she realized she was tired, exhausted by a marriage that felt like emotional solitary confinement. She didn't want to save the king, and she didn't want to watch him die. She wanted to escape. She wanted to matter, even if mattering required a fire in her veins that would finally scream louder than his silence. "I want to try your selection," she murmured, her voice barely rising above the hum of the air conditioning. Her tone was soft and undemanding, the same one she used when asking if he had remembered his mother's birthday, a sound he had trained himself to ignore. As expected, Lorenzo didn't pause his conversation. He didn't look up from his spreadsheets. He simply allowed her to reach across the table, his mind already moving on to the next $1 million deal. Elena's fingers closed around the cold crystal stem, and as she lifted the poisoned wine to her lips, she felt a strange, terrifying peace. She wasn't just drinking to save him, she was drinking to finally be seen. The metallic burn started in her throat the moment the liquid touched her tongue. It wasn't the warm, rich bloom of a vintage Bordeaux, it was a chemical fire that spread with terrifying speed, searing its way down her esophagus. Elena's chest tightened as if an invisible hand were squeezing her lungs, her heart stuttering against her ribs like it had suddenly forgotten the steady rhythm it had kept for 30 years. Her hand flew to her chest in a reflexive, desperate grab for something solid as the ground beneath her began to shift and liquefy. Across the mahogany table, Lorenzo didn't move. He didn't look up from the blue light of his device. "If the shipment clears by Tuesday, we're ahead of schedule," he murmured, his thumb flicking across the screen as he calculated profit margins and container manifests. He was a man obsessed with the language of power, a language that had no words for the woman dying 18 inches away from him. Elena's vision fractured into kaleidoscope shards. The amber glow of the chandelier above split into 1,000 pieces of gold light that no longer fit together. Sound began to distort, Lorenzo's voice becoming an underwater garble, muffled and distant as if he were speaking from the other side of a deep pool. She tried to draw a breath, but her lungs felt like they were filled with lead. The silk of her gown rustled as she began to tilt, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion she had carried for 6 years. The white linen napkin slipped from her lap, a purple-black stain spreading across its surface like a macabre watercolor under the soft restaurant lights. Then came the sound, the dull, heavy thud of her body hitting the hardwood floor. Yet, the silence didn't follow. Not yet. Lorenzo continued to speak. "We need to ensure the customs clearance is handled before the senior advisors arrive next week," he said, his tone flat and professional. 1 second passed. 2. His eyes remained fixed on the logistics spreadsheets. 3 seconds. 4. He was explaining container routing to a room that had gone deathly still. 5 seconds. 6. The accountant sat frozen, his breath hitched in his throat. 7 seconds. 8. Even the air in the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the king to notice that his foundation had collapsed. 9. It was only at the 10th second that the absence of her soft, rhythmic breathing finally cut through his concentration. It was a silence so loud, so absolute, that it achieved what 6 years of devotion never could. It forced him to look up. Lorenzo turned, his irritation at the interruption already forming on his lips, only to find an empty chair. His gaze dropped to the floor, where Elena lay slumped against the wood, her expensive silk dress fanned out around her like a broken wing. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring at a ceiling she could no longer see, her lips tinged with a faint, haunting purple. "Elena," he whispered, the word feeling foreign in his throat. He said it again, louder this time, the Iron Boss, finally realizing that while he was busy conquering the world, he had allowed the only person who truly mattered to slide into the dark. For the first time in his life, the man who controlled everything felt the crushing weight of a silence he couldn't negotiate his way out of. The private room remained frozen in the wake of the crash, the air thick with the smell of spilled wine and the sudden, chilling scent of ozone. Lorenzo stared at the floor, his brain still struggling to bridge the gap between his shipping manifests and the reality of his wife's unmoving body. But where he faltered, Isabella, the matriarch who had survived 5 decades in this world by noticing what others dismissed, snapped the room to attention with the lethal precision of a gunshot. She didn't gasp, and she didn't reach for her pearls. Instead, she set her wine glass down with a deliberate click that sounded like a death knell against the mahogany. Her eyes, cold and sharp as shards of obsidian, didn't move to Elena first. They went to Marco, whose face had drained of all color, and then to the sommelier, who was already backing into the shadows. "Marco, call the doctor now," she commanded, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Tell him it is aconite. Use his name so he knows his life depends on how fast he arrives." Lorenzo finally moved, his expensive shoes scuffing the wood as he dropped to his knees beside Elena, but Isabella's voice cut him down before he could touch her. "Do not act surprised now, Lorenzo," she said, her tone landing like a gavel. He looked up, his face slack with confusion, his fingers trembling as they hovered over Elena's cooling skin. "Mother, the wine, I don't understand," he stammered, the Iron Boss sounding like a lost child. Isabella stood up, her burgundy suit perfectly pressed, her silver hair unmoved by the chaos. She looked down at him with a mixture of pity and cold fury. "You don't understand because you stopped looking at her 6 years ago," she said, her words slicing through the room's heavy silence. "You think she fell? You think this was just a mistake? Look at that glass." She saw the shimmer. She saw the poison meant for you, and she drank it anyway. Lorenzo's hand flew to Elena's wrist, finding a pulse so thready it felt like a ghost's heartbeat. "She saved me," he whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "No," Isabella corrected, her voice dropping to a whisper that echoed in the corners of the mahogany-paneled room. "She didn't just save you, Lorenzo. She used your brother's poison as an escape plan. She has been invisible in your house for so long that she decided dying was the only way to finally get your attention." She leaned over the table, her shadow falling across the shipping manifest still glowing on Lorenzo's phone. "She was driven to this floor by your neglect. You built an empire and forgot the woman who was holding it together. Now, look at her. You finally noticed her, didn't you? It only took her death for you to finally put down your phone." Isabella turned her gaze to the guard standing at the door. "No one leaves. No one calls anyone but the doctor. This family handles its own emergencies." She looked back at her son, who was finally cradling Elena's head, his face contorted in a way she hadn't seen since his father died. "Hold her, Lorenzo. Hold her and pray she survives, because if she dies tonight, you didn't lose a wife. You murdered a ghost." The private dining room at the Meridian became a blur of frantic motion and stifled whispers as Lorenzo scooped Elena up into his arms. He had lifted heavy crates in shipping yards and carried the bodies of men he had eliminated, but as he stood, his hands shook with a terrifying, unfamiliar tremors. She felt impossibly light, like a bird with hollow bones. As her head lulled against his shoulder, the silk of her cream gown, a fabric he hadn't touched until now, felt cold and slick against his skin. He strode toward the exit, his long strides echoing against the hardwood, but his mind was trapped in the suffocating realization that he was carrying a stranger. He looked down at her face, illuminated by the harsh, passing lights of the hallway, and felt a jolt of recognition that was actually a confession. He hadn't truly looked at her since their wedding day. For 6 years, she had been a fixed point in his peripheral vision, as reliable and unexamined as the furniture in his office. He remembered the veil, the white lace, and the promise of a partnership, but the woman in his arms now had fine lines around her eyes and a sharpness to her jawline that he had never noticed. She had aged, she had changed, and she had suffered, all while he was busy calculating container manifests and customs clearance. The weight of her body was almost nothing, but the weight of his neglect was becoming unbearable. He realized with a sickening twist in his gut that she had become fragile because he had stopped providing the strength she needed. She had been the shock absorber for his entire empire, softening the edges of his brutality and shielding their triplet from the coldness of his world, and he had let her wear herself down to almost nothing. As he reached the private medical facility, the guards stepped aside, their faces masks of professional indifference, but Lorenzo felt like the world was screaming. He lowered her onto the gurney with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed, his fingers lingering on her cold, pale hand. Her lips remained tinged with that haunting purple, a physical manifestation of the poison she had swallowed because she thought it was the only way to be heard. As the medical team swarmed around her, pushing him back, Lorenzo stood frozen in the sterilized light of the hallway. He looked at his own hands, the hands that had built a crime syndicate, and realized they were empty. He had spent 6 years chasing power, only to find that he had lost the only person who had ever truly known the man beneath the black suit. 1 week had passed when Elena finally sat propped against the pillows of the private medical suite. The sterile walls were the color of cream, and the windows overlooked a garden designed to look peaceful from the inside while guards patrolled the perimeter outside. Her color was slowly returning, but something fundamental had changed in the way she held her body. She moved with a deliberate, careful stillness, like a string that had been pulled too tight for 6 years had finally snapped. The door opened, and Lorenzo entered carrying white orchids. He also held a small Tiffany box, that iconic blue that was supposed to make everything better. He had rehearsed his words in the car and in the elevator, standing outside her door for minutes before finding the courage to enter. He sat in the chair beside her bed, placing the orchids on the windowsill while the blue box remained in his hands. "I should have listened," he began, his voice sounding hollow in the quiet room. Elena didn't respond, merely watching him with eyes that were present but distant. He spoke of how she had tried to warn him about the financial discrepancies and the brother's behavior, admitting he had dismissed her by saying she didn't understand the business. He opened the Tiffany box to reveal a delicate diamond bracelet, the kind of thing she never wore because she had nowhere to wear it except grocery runs and lonely school pickups. "I should have trusted your instincts," Lorenzo continued, his focus entirely on his professional oversight. "You have good judgment. I won't make that mistake again." Elena looked at the bracelet, then at the orchids, and finally at him. She took the box and admired the jewelry with the mechanical attention one gives to things that no longer matter. She set it on the bedside table beside the water pitcher and the call button she hadn't pressed once in 7 days. "Thank you," she said, her voice flat and polite, the tone she used when coordinating the triplet school schedules. "It's beautiful." Lorenzo felt the disconnect, though he didn't yet understand what it meant. He believed he was fixing a mistake by promising to value her business analysis in the future. He thought he was apologizing for a lack of trust in her competence, failing to realize he was apologizing for the wrong betrayal entirely. "Lorenzo," she said quietly, cutting through his talk of shipping deals and secured territories. "When was the last time you asked me how I was doing? Not the triplet, not the house, me?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He mentally scrolled through weeks of text messages and calendar coordination, but he genuinely could not remember. The silence stretched heavy between them, confirming everything she already knew. "I warned you about the money because I pay attention," she said, her voice a whisper of exhausted truth. "But I had to nearly die for you to finally look at me. And even now, you're apologizing for not listening to my business analysis." She gestured to the orchids and the diamonds. "You're not apologizing for the fact that I've been invisible to you for 6 years." She looked him directly in the eyes, her gaze raw and unblinking. "I didn't just drink that poison to save you, Lorenzo. I didn't drink the fire for you, I drank it for me." She watched the shock register on his face. I drank it because I was so tired of being a ghost that death felt like the only escape that wouldn't make me a monster. The silence of the mansion was louder than the city's underworld as Lorenzo stood in the kitchen at 6:30 a.m., staring at a carton of eggs like it was a decryption code he couldn't break. He had spent his life commanding men who moved at his slightest nod, but as his 4-year-old triplet appeared in the doorway with messy hair and expectant glares, he realized he was unarmed. He had never scrambled an egg. He didn't even know how many a child was supposed to eat. He was the Iron Boss, yet he felt a surge of panic as his son, Nico, tilted his head with brutal honesty and told him, "You don't cook, Daddy." The morning quickly devolved into a strategic disaster. Lorenzo used a heavy cast iron pan instead of non-stick, forgot the butter, and ended up with eggs that were blackened and rubbery. The toast was cold because he had made it first, unaware of the delicate timing Elena had perfected over 6 years. When he placed a blue plastic cup on the table, Gianna didn't eat. She started to sob as if the world were ending. Lorenzo stared, genuinely lost, asking what was wrong, only to be met with a wail that her juice was in the wrong cup. He searched the cabinets, his heart racing faster than it did during territory wars, until he finally found the pink bunny cup hidden behind the others. He handed it to her like a peace treaty, but the demands didn't stop. Luca insisted the toast had to be cut into triangles because triangles taste better, a piece of science Lorenzo accepted with complete, humbled seriousness. He was being bossed around by toddlers who delighted in the fact that Daddy didn't know the rules of his own home. By the time his mother, Sophia, arrived to find him covered in flour and maple syrup, she simply observed that he was 30 years late to the reality of his own life. The true defeat, however, came at 2:15 a.m. when a nightmare sent Gianna screaming for her mother. Lorenzo rushed to the room, his old marine instincts flaring, but his presence didn't bring peace. He tried to hold her, but she sobbed harder, calling for the parent who knew exactly how to present the stuffed bunny and which book to read 4 nights in a row. As he sat on the floor of the nursery, listening to his daughter hiccup with grief for her mother's touch, the weight of his empire felt like nothing compared to the weight of his failure. He realized then that Elena wasn't just a wife or a manager of his calendar, she was the very foundation upon which his entire world rested. Without her invisible labor, he wasn't a king, he was just a man sitting in the dark, finally realizing how much he had ignored. 3 months had passed since the night the wine shimmered with a lethal green, and the air in the Moretti mansion finally felt thin enough to breathe. The grand mahogany table, once a canyon of 18 inches that separated 2 strangers, now hosted a different kind of geometry. There was no upscale steakhouse, no nervous sommelier, and most importantly, no blue light of a smartphone illuminating the space between them. Lorenzo sat at the center, but his hands weren't scrolling through logistic spreadsheets or container manifests. His phone sat in a drawer in the foyer, a silent surrender he had maintained for 4 nights a week. He watched Elena across the table. She wasn't the portrait of perfect, silent compliance anymore. She moved with a tentative ease, no longer checking the room for threats or smoothing over the cold edges of his personality. The triplet, Luca, Nico, and Gianna, ate their dinner with a boisterous energy that would have been silenced months ago. Lorenzo didn't look at them as business appointments on a Google Calendar. He knew now that Luca needed his toast cut into triangles and that Gianna required the pink bunny cup to feel safe. He had spent weeks learning the invisible language of his own home, learning that parenting at dawn was a far more complex war than any territory dispute. As the children finished and ran toward the garden, a heavy, yet comfortable silence settled over the table. It wasn't the crushing weight of neglect, but the quiet of 2 people realizing they were standing on the ruins of an old life, trying to build something new. Lorenzo looked at Elena, really looked at her, noticing the way the evening light caught the gray in her hair and the depth in her eyes that he had been blind to for 6 years. "How are you doing?" he asked. He didn't ask about the household or the triplet milestones. He waited, actually waited, for an answer that wasn't a status update. Elena considered him, her gaze raw and honest. "Some days I'm still angry," she admitted, her voice steady. "Some days I still see the man who made me a ghost." Lorenzo didn't offer a diamond bracelet or a promise of business involvement. He reached across the 18 inches that used to be an abyss and took her hand. His palm was warm, his grip certain. "I'm terrified I'll fail again," he said, his voice raw with a vulnerability the Iron Boss was never supposed to show. "But I'm here. I'm finally here." In that moment, the 18-inch canyon finally closed. For the first time since their wedding day, Elena didn't feel like a shock absorber or a piece of background furniture. She felt the air fill her lungs, a real breath taken in a house that finally felt like a home. The Mafia world outside hadn't changed, but the woman at the table had. She was no longer a ghost, she was a woman who was finally, truly, seen. As the echoes of the silence at the dinner table fade, we are left to look into a mirror that reflects more than just a Mafia story. Elena's journey from a useful ghost to a woman who demanded to be seen reminds us that the greatest empires aren't built on shipping routes or profit margins, but on the invisible hearts of those holding them together. Lorenzo's power was a hollow fortress until he realized that true leadership isn't about controlling a territory, it's about noticing the person sitting 18 inches away. This story challenges us to ask, have you ever been in a room full of people and still felt completely alone? In a world that celebrates hustle and business focus, it is easy to treat our loved ones like background noise or appointments on a Google Calendar. But as Elena's sacrifice shows, even a heroic act can be a desperate cry for escape when someone has been erased for too long. It shouldn't take a tragedy, a poisoned glass, or a hospital bed for a partner to finally look up from their phone and acknowledge the weight their companion is carrying. Now, we want to hear from you. Do you believe Lorenzo truly changed, or was he just reacting to the guilt of nearly losing his foundation? If you were Elena, would you have the patience to let a man learn how to be a father and a husband after 6 years of neglect, or would you have walked away the moment you were strong enough to leave? Drop a comment below with Team Stay or Team Leave. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe. We tell the stories of those who refuse to disappear into the roles others expect them to play. Don't let yourself become a ghost in your own home. Remember, you are not a martyr, and you are not a shadow. You matter.